Well, good evening, everybody. You might recall back in the day, we had a series of rather, well, stupendous exhibitions at the V&A. They were begun in the year 2000 with Art Nouveau, and then we moved in 2003 to Art Deco, and modernism came around in 2005. I think that exhibitions on this scale now would be very difficult today for a whole variety of reasons, COVID withstanding, because they involve so many lenders and also a great deal of money to bring in the loans. So I was very lucky to be able to visit both. And I'm showing you the front covers of the Art Deco catalogue. As you can see, it shows a car. It's an Hispano Suiza, and on the front of it has a rather wonderful mascot. And one of the themes of Art Deco was to capture the essence of speed, as many people felt that modernity, modern life, was really all about technology and new advances. But Art Deco was very much focused on fashion, and the high point of it was Paris 1925, where the French literally ruled the roost. Whereas whereas modernism was driven by a sort of an intellectual ideology, one that was trying to also confront modernity, but which was much more down to earth, with massive housing shortages after the First World War. Modernism really was trying to create a brave new world. So as you can see here, it actually says that, designing a new world. The guy who appears to have taken flight is actually leaping off a diving board. And the car in this case is a Tatra car, which has been sort of like beautifully modeled or streamlined. And streamlining was a way forward, particularly adopted in America. So don't be confused that these two developments, one very much driven by politics and an ideology that's driven really by utilitarianism. As you can see, the dates 1914, 1939, and the Bauhaus is actually established in 1919, and Art Deco almost exactly the same time, but the complete flip side, an art movement dedicated to luxury and hedonism. I'll let you decide by the end of the evening which side of the coin you would rather be. The Bauhaus has had a huge influence, largely because of the rise of fascism. By 1933, many of the masters in the Bauhaus school realized that their future was in jeopardy, and so many fled via London to America. So by the time you get into the post-Second World War era, modernism has entered what is referred to as its international phase. And so it's not surprising that there were many celebrations for the founding of the Bauhaus, 100 years, 2019, with a whole series of new galleries and museums opening. We now have 3 sites for the Bauhaus. We have the Weimar, we have Dessau, and we have Berlin, where the Bauhaus archive is kept. And this was the magnificent building, opened right at the end of 2019, which, as you can see, is epitome really of modern architecture, being mostly glass and steel. So this is just to remind you of the brevity of the Bauhaus. I think they've estimated that only around about 1,250 students ever went through the Bauhaus during its lifetime. And there would never be more than 30 or 40 students there at any one time. It was exclusive. So its dates, as you can see here, in the Weimar from 1919 to 1925, when they are driven out by an increasingly conservative and narrow-minded regime. Then to Dessau, which was at the cutting edge of modern technology until 1932. And then the Rump, which is all very sad, in Berlin from 1932 to 1933. And we have 3 heads, Walter Gropius until 1928, Hans Meyer, who's there during 2 very difficult years, and then Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, who is there to close the Bauhaus in effect. in 1933, which of course was like the death knell for most advanced culture throughout Europe. So most of us know the Bauhaus today really through its chairs, which have become iconic and which are very easy to acquire. In fact, you can even buy them through John Lewis. But like all reproductions, they will vary in quality and in price, depending on your, on your supplier. So if you could afford the Conran Centre, I would go there. On the left-hand side, we have the Wasilli Kandinsky chair, which is named after the artist Wasilli Kandinsky, who was part of the Bauhaus. And on the right-hand side, we have an equally famous cantilever chair by Marcel Brauer. And coming up over them, the Barcelona Chair by Mies van der Rohe. And all these chairs, although, as I say, varying in quality, are all in production today. So you could easily have found, particularly if you were in the office of a solicitor or one of the city gents, that you might well be sitting on a Barcelona chair. The originals now retail for a staggering £70,000 to £80,000. But I want to take our story back to how the Bauhaus ever came about in the first place. We know it was founded immediately after the war in 1919 to usher in a brave new world, but its roots can actually be found in the years leading up to the war, particularly in the relationship between the wonderfully named Grand Duke Wilhelm Ernst of Saxe-Weimar-Eisenach. That's a long title, isn't it? And Henry or Henri van der Velde, who you see here looking similarly intellectually posed. Van der Velde was one of the leading avant-garde architects working in Europe around 1900. He is usually linked to the Belgian avant-garde and Art Nouveau, as it's referred to in that country. But he found his position in Brussels undermined by one Victor Horta, who was very much leading the Belgian Art Nouveau school. And so Henri van der Velde moved on, initially to Berlin, but then he was invited by the Grand Duke Wilhelm Ernst to go to Weimar to establish an arts and crafts school. Now in Germany, Art Nouveau is not called Art Nouveau, it's called Jugendstil. And the Germans were very keen not to copy the French. They wanted their own brand of modernity. And so you can see that they brought in van der Velde to basically to spearhead this idea. So here, this is his house in the Weimar. And I'm sure that at first glance, you might think that Charles Rennie Mackintosh might have designed it. Van der Velde's generation includes Antonio Gaudí in Barcelona of the Modernista school, and of course Mackintosh and the Glasgow school. In fact, Art Nouveau, Jugendstil Secession, as it's variously called, depending on which country you're in, comes to a apogee in 1902, the very year that Van der Velde went to the Weimar. It demanded the Gesamtkunstwerk, the idea that an architect should be in control of all aspects of design, both inside and out. And following in the footsteps of Mackintosh, you can see here an element of minimalism. So one of the main key ingredients we're going to see at the Bauhaus is a gradual stripping away of ornament. The Bauhaus was a pioneer in terms of teaching. And again, those ideas can be traced back to Van der Velde, who established the Arts and Crafts School in the Weimar. And this is the original offices. I should say that all of the buildings in the Weimar are now part of a UNESCO protected area. I rather like the horseshoe shape, which was one of Van der Velde's signatures. But most importantly, whilst Van der Velde was in the Weimar, he was given the job of creating the Nietzsche Archive. Now, I don't know about you, but when I started to study all of this, I'd somehow imagined that Nietzsche was actually an 18th century philosopher. But in fact, he dies in 1900, and the archive is created by his sister. It's already moved to Weimar by 1896 and is originally accommodated in a villa. But then van der Velde is given the commission to create a purpose-built library. Not only is this a paragon of modernist design, but it's also very important that you understand the influence of Nietzsche on the German psyche. It was this idea that art had a role to play in society. It was not art for art's sake, but quite the opposite. It was this idea that mankind could be improved and elevated through art. And you might remember one of the sort of catchphrases, if I could put it that way, of Nietzsche is Superman, that we all have the capacity, if we work hard and educate and refine ourselves, to all become supermen. Yes, you're probably thinking to yourself, this is going to end up in Aryan supremacy, and you're not wrong, as of course Hitler was wedded to Nietzsche. In Turin in 1902, Peter Behrens, one of the leading architects of the Jugendstil style, created the wonderfully named Hamburger Vorhau, Hamburg as in the place. And this was a celebration of Nietzschean philosophy. It was the idea that we were going to arise to a new dawn of arts and culture. And this was emphasized by the skylight, which you might just be able to see here, but you can see much better in my slide, which is a close-up of the skylight. In also Zarathustra, our prophet comes out of his cave and embraces the sun, and this is represented in crystalline light. You can see the forms here of the fanlight and also the elaborate cover designed by Behrens for Thus Spake Zarathustra, echoing this sort of new geometric linear style, which was then sort of like replicated throughout this interior entrance. None of this exists anymore, by the way, sadly. It was all a temporary installation. But it helps to understand this, the reason why German architects and designers took art and design so seriously. They were on a mission. They were inspired by, of course, William Morris, who believed that we had a sort of like right to create a beautiful world, to live in a beautiful world, and to surround ourselves with objects which were perhaps beautifully made, but certainly well designed. Behrens definitely belongs more to the world of art and industry, to arts and craft, because from 1907 to 1914, he was chief artistic advisor for AEG, and he designed everything for them, from their letterheads to their kettles. He was the first to design an electric fan, the first to design a toaster, believe it or not. And here you're seeing a range of electric kettles, the first one designed in 1909. But as I said, he designed everything from their letterhead to these wonderful, as you can see, graphic posters, where the emphasis is very much on geometric forms. And we have one example of Behrens' unique and progressive style here in England, believe it or not, in Northampton. So you might have heard of 78 Derngate. This is Mackintosh's only major commission south of the border. But sadly, when Bassett Loke, who was the client, had the money and was in a position to build a much bigger house of his own on the sort of, it's actually sort of going on to, not quite the outskirts of Northampton, but it's on a major suburban road leading out of the town. But when he was able to do this, Mackintosh was nowhere to be seen. He'd already, I'm afraid, left for France. And so Bassett Loke commissioned Peter Behrens in 1926 to build New Ways. And as you can see, it's it's a classic modernist house with the flat roof, the white surfaces, and that rather lovely staircase going up the middle with that window highlighted at the top, 1926. Now, you might think that this is an excursion, but it isn't really, because Peter Behrens is very important in our story, because by 1910, he was training in his architectural offices Walter Gropius, future head of the Bauhaus, Mies van der Rohe, also a future head of the Bauhaus, and Le Corbusier, who's actually Swiss, by the way, in terms of his origins. And that's his real name, Charles Edouard Généré. Le Corbusier is actually a nickname which by the way means man with a large nose, le corbu. Love it. I've always thought that Mies van der Rohe, who's down the bottom, looks rather like Alfred Hitchcock. Right, so the new architectural style demanded using the very latest materials and really thinking about the human body as a machine working within a machine. So Walter Gropius, working here with Adolf Meyer, produces one of these exemplary modern buildings. It was actually a shoe factory. It's almost like a hive because you could see everything going on inside. You know, using a concrete or steel frame, this enabled very large windows. And this is going to be a feature of Bauhaus architecture as well. Light was always going to be sort of almost a symbolic and philosophical element in these modernist buildings. And this comes to a head in 1914 at the Werkbund exhibition in Cologne with Bruno Tort's glass architecture. Now again, this doesn't exist. It was a temporary structure. It glowed at night, as you can see in my model. And on the inside, it was again a celebration of electricity, of this idea of the lights of enlightenment. And many of the forms were crystalline, as you can see, going back to that sort of Nietzsche idea of the crystal of enlightenment. All of this comes to become much clearer when you can see that the very front cover of the Bauhaus Manifesto, published in 1919, again emphasizes this idea of the crystalline light of enlightenment. So officially the Bauhaus was declared on the 12th of April 1919. And most importantly, in terms of the developments of the fine and decorative arts, what had been the fine arts school will be combined with the Kunstgewerbe School, that's the arts and crafts school, to make the Stalag Bauhaus in Weimar. It just means literally building house. And then if we look at the quote, and by the way, the frontispiece was by Lionel Feniger, one of the most important Bauhaus artists. But the quote, "Together let us desire, conceive and create the new structure for the future, which will embrace architecture and sculpture and painting in one unity." Now, we've been working towards this for the last 100 years. This is something that Morris advocated, that all the arts should unite under the one umbrella of architecture. And these perfect buildings in which everything will be conceived by artists will one day rise from the hands of a million workers like the crystal symbol of a new faith. So I think we can safely say that for many, art was in effect a new religion. It was a means to basically self-improvement, purification and elevation. So here are our cast of characters. And I would like to point out that some of them are not that young. So it's not a question of all of them being angry rebels. Wasilli Kandinsky, born in 1866, celebrates his 60th birthday in 1926. But we have Paul Klee, we have Walter Gropius, and then Mies van der Rohe and Marcel Brouwer, who will be head, when I say carpentry, it's really the furniture department. So these are our key figures. However, we mustn't forget that the Bauhaus was part of a much bigger international movement known as modernism with a capital M. The Bauhaus is going to be very influenced by Dutch style, which was almost in a vacuum because the Netherlands hadn't been really affected by the First World War. The leading protagonists here are Theo van Doesburg, my apologies, born in 1883. Piet Mondrian, again, this emphasizes how all of these groups were trying to unify various different arts, because obviously Piet Mondrian is best known as a painter. Theo van Doesburg, it's ironically, as is, in fact, this is very common, is another pseudonym. So he founds De Stijl, and it's also a journal, so their ideas are spread far and wide. And Gerrit Rietveld, who you see at the top there, sat in his famous chair, was also part of the style. And they are moving towards this idea of geometric forms, as you can see, and the rather alarmingly published manifesto of neoplasticism. In France, this is known as Purism and is headed by Corbusier. Also, as you can see, another pseudonym, as we've already discussed. And we've also tended to cloak the women behind the men. So we now know that Charlotte Perriand was a major collaborator of Corbusier and had a hand in much of the furniture. The only really major woman to gain recognition at the time was Eileen Gray. And I'm showing you her famous Bibendum chair down the bottom, as she too embraced the latest materials and technology. So all of these groups will influence each other, and we must see the Bauhaus as part of a much bigger pan-European movement. So what were they proposing? Well, it was to get rid of that. They didn't like historicism. They didn't like the rehashing of past styles. They didn't like clutter. All of this was condemned as bourgeois. And obviously the Bauhaus outlook was socialist, if not communist. So one of the reasons why it was always politically sensitive. This is the poster for the wonderfully named The Dwelling. The fact that they called them houses and dwellings rather than homes gives you some idea of the ideology that we have to battle with. And the Werkbund exhibition in Stuttgart presented a whole range of ideal housing for the working classes. So the big red line through the clutter. Equally, they want to embrace modern technology. So this in Brno was an exhibition for 1929. So we're looking at a train, an airport, an ocean liner, and you might wonder what this is. In fact, it's Zeppelin hangars. And the adding machine, well, their attempt, of course, at a computer. So the idea is that modernism has got to reflect the way that we are living in 1920, but also looking ahead to how technology will impact the way that we live. So it was forward looking. So the idea that craft was going to play a major element in this was quickly abandoned, because the problem with crafts is they are time consuming and expensive, often demanding top quality materials. And the Bauhaus set out to really create good design for everybody. A modern equivalent would be IKEA, though you might blanch at the thought. So Machine Man would replace the craftsman. And this is Herbert Bayer's wonderful exhibition poster for the exhibition of 1923, where, as you can see, man has been turned literally into machine. And it was Macaulay Nudge who is very much behind this. We'll meet Macaulay properly in a minute, but please note here that in this photograph, he looks like a workman rather than an individualistic artist. In fact, initially, the most influential artist in the Bauhaus was Johannes Itten. He was very much a sort of monk-like philosopher, as you can see from my photograph. And he was in charge of the foundation course that all artists had to undertake when they entered the Bauhaus. So being an individualist, his most important contribution to the Bauhaus was his passion for colour. So I'm showing you Circles of 1916, which you might think looks a little bit like a Sonia Delaunay. And then down the bottom, his Colour Wheel of 1921, which all the Bauhaus students had to learn. And then later he's refined that, because he carries on working after he leaves the Bauhaus to his death in 1967. That's refined into his Colour Wheel of 1961. And you're going to find that really in terms of ornamentation, well, the only ornament that the Bauhaus will allow will be colour. You can't see me, but I'm wearing Bauhaus red. So this is Wasilli Kandinsky's Yellow, Red, Blue, which is in the Paris Pompidou Centre. Because there's always a tension in the Bauhaus between this idea of individuality, the desire on the part of the artist to create work that is, you know, sui generis, specifically theirs, created through their own unique style, beautifully illustrated by the Wasilli Kandinsky that you see here, and then the sort of utilitarian outlook that's very much associated with Russian constructivism. So Moholy, I mean, this is always difficult, he's Hungarian, so the G is a J, so it should be Nagy. Moholy Nagy basically was a Russian constructivist working in the Bauhaus. He arrived in 1923 and he completely takes over the foundation course, crushes the sort of Johannes Itten individualist outlook, advocating constructivism, a rationalist approach, and he was also a technophile. He will really shift the Bauhaus from craft to industrial mass production, advocating, of course, the suppression of individuality and a new world of machine geometric forms. The artist is now an engineer and apparently in charge of organizing all aspects of life. So again, it's this idea that art is in the service of society. I'm showing you down the bottom his light space modulator, designed for the Werkbund project in Paris of 1930, to show you again that they were keen to break down the boundaries between the different arts, flat art, sculpture, architecture. And so the little perforations that you can see in the grey element of my painting appear to be a sort of precursor for his light space modulator. So Russian constructivism had a huge impact on what was going on at the Bauhaus. L. Lissitzky's, whose famous Beat the Whites with the Red Wedge, is, as it says, about the tussle in terms of politics at the end of the First World War. We have the White Russians being beaten by the Red Soviets. In 1921, he's actually appointed Russian cultural attaché to the Weimar, so has a direct impact on the Bauhaus. Nam Gabo, another, I'm afraid, pseudonym, his real name is Pevsner, was another Russian constructivist who had a huge impact on the Bauhaus. I'm showing you here from the Tate, his rather wonderful head number 2, 1916. He was very keen on the negatives, the spaces, the voids within his sculpture. He has a manifesto published in 1920, again demanding that art reflect its own era. And he taught at the Bauhaus after Moholy Nagy left in 1928. You might be aware that Gabo actually comes to England and he'll go down and work in St. Ives alongside Barbara Hepworth and Ben Nicholson. But like many Bauhaus masters, he will end up in America, emigrating in 1946. I'm hoping I'm showing to you how international Bauhaus was and how many influences come to play. So Kasamir Malevich is a supremacist. So this is another Russian constructivist. And I'm showing you his airplane flying of 1915. But the idea was to take these suprematist compositions and put them onto three-dimensional objects, albeit here in the form of a pattern, as well as the actual shape of the object, which is supposed to be, by the way, a suprematist inkwell by Nikolai Suetin of 1923. This is all very intellectual stuff, isn't it, to have behind your ashtray by Mariana Brandt. Moholy's circular segment is 1921. And the idea here was to take these flat forms and to turn them into something literally three-dimensional. And Moholy always seems to go for straight or compass ruled lines. So this is Mariana Brandt. I mean, we're going to hear more about the women, but she certainly creates a reputation within her chosen specialist field, which is metalwork. Her famous Nothing as Common as a Teapot, a tea infuser of 1924. Two versions of it here. And you can see that functionalism means that you can identify all the different aspects of the teapot. The spout separate, the propeller-like feet, which would have influenced Clarice Cliff, by the way, because she comes later. and then the handle, every element in the teapot can be identified to its function. And its shape again is inspired by Moholy's concept of Russian constructivism. So this is another poster for the exhibition of 1923 showing intersecting geometric forms which have literally been drawn with a ruler and a compass. So Theo van Doesburg arrives in the Weimar in April 1921. He's hoping to be taken on as a master, but Walter Gropius realizes that he's far too dominant a character to actually to embrace him within the Bauhaus. But the radical ideas of de Stijl nevertheless are disseminated through Van Doesburg's soirees, where many of the teachers went to socialize, like Lionel Feniger, Paul Klee, and Kandinsky. Showing you here a Doesburg from around about 1921, you might think you're looking at a Mondrian, but they had a big falling out in the mid-1920s because Van Doesburg argued that they should bring in diagonals. So his counter compositions, this one's number 16, that's the bottom one is number 16, and subtitled A Dissonance. This leads to a huge falling out with Mondrian. They never speak to each other again, hardly, because Mondrian believes in balance, it's like feng shui, harmony of only using parallel and vertical and horizontal lines. And Van Doesburg wants diagonals, and this is heresy as far as Mondrian is concerned. So here they all are, just to give you an idea of what an amazing fly on the wall you would be if you had been to the International Congress of Constructivists and Dadaists. You remember the Dada lot, again, are doing their best to undermine the concept of art with Marcel Duchamp's famous urinal. He finds things and turns them into works of art. Kurt Schwitters, you might recognize some of these names, Hans Arp, and then most importantly, Theo van Doesburg is the dandy here with the cap on, and his long-suffering wife Nellie is equally there as well. I say long-suffering because she rather gets dragged around Europe. So failing to get a permanent position in the Bauhaus, Van Doesburg sets off for Paris. So whilst he's with the Bauhaus, he does a lot to undermine Gropius, emphasizing machine production and technology. And they have their own little clique, Curie, construction, utilitarianism, rational and international. But in 1923, he goes off to Paris. He gets a commission to create 2 ideal homes, La Maison Particulière, which just means a private house, and the house for an artist. And this is where his counter-construction ideas come to fruition because they go 3D. And he creates a house which basically has a stairwell, it's this element here, around which all the rooms are thrown off at sort of like in different levels. So, it's like mezzanine levels, but all round. So, it's almost like a spiral design of rooms thrown off this central staircase. So he's definitely thinking vertically. However, back at the Bauhaus in 1923, we have the first of their attempts at an ideal home. This is the Haus am Horn. It's just called that. A horn is like a promontory, because that was the road it was built on. Just Schmidt creates the very famous poster with Machine Man at the top, the profile I'm referring to, and the Bauhaus lettering. And Adolf Meyer, who we've met already, was one of the collaborators in creating the Haus am Horn. It has an unusual plan. It has a big central salon or drawing room. It is, however, supposed to be for every man. And because they were worried about heating, that is like the cozy bit in the middle. Again, all the deprivations of the post-war era. And then this is where the mother slept, and this is where the father slept, and that's where the children slept. Now you might be wondering how they got any children, as it was advised that husband and wives slept apart. But the reason for that evidently was men needed a good night's sleep to get up and do a thorough day's work the next day. So the women were in their own space so they could be there to look after the children. I don't think I do very well in this brave new world. Anyway, here is this paragon of virtue. Now, the children's room, the idea of having a children's play area, very kindergarten, very sort of Petzolotsky, again, learning through doing. And we know that Alma Scheidhoff-Buscher designed the furniture and the toys for that room. However, it was the kitchen by Benita Koch-Otter, which was most influential, as this was one of the pioneering built-in kitchens. So it's all about ergonomics and the whole idea, again, of creating a working space for a woman who was likely to have fewer servants, if any servants at all. After all, if you are a committed socialist, should you really have servants? Theodor Bogler is famous because he designed the ceramics, which, believe it or not, were a breakthrough, as they actually identified the commodities within. And this led directly to the first commercially commissioned built-in kitchen, known as the Frankfurch Kitchen, and made initially between 1926 and 1927, and designed by the Austrian architect Greta, she preferred to be known, Schutter-Lihotzky. Goodness, that's a bit of a mouthful. Over in England, we didn't really like any of this modernist idea of utilitarianism. You can see here that there's a table that can come down at the back here, probably for the ironing, and the whole thing is designed, you know, to be labour saving and ergonomic. So this is Heath Robinson in a bungaloid. You remember his famous contraptions. I do love the way the baby's in a drawer, and you know, you have the lady of the house here having to perform at different levels. So we were always deeply suspicious of modernism, whether it was French, German or Dutch. The central well of the house, which was also, as you can see, a light well, is now, I think, rather upscale in terms of its array of wonderful paintings. I'm not sure the working classes were going to get those, but most importantly, what I want you to concentrate on here is the furniture by Marcel Brauer, which doesn't look to have been designed particularly for comfort, does it? But again is echoing the De Stijl style, because it's very much in the idiom of Gerrit Rietveld, who had designed his infamous red-blue chair without its distinctive colours as early as 1917. And then Mondrian got hold of it and coloured it red, blue, black and yellow. And Rietveld also designed the iconic end table that you see at the top. And he was very keen on deconstructing cabinet making. So he never wanted to use expensive materials. And the idea was that an idiot, that would include me, by the way, could put these DIY components together. So Gerald Rietveld's most famous house is in Utrecht. It was a combination of clients and designer working together. The client was Trusch Schroeder, so it's known as the Rietveld Schroeder House. It's an exemplary modernist house, as you can see, open plan. Believe it or not, on the left-hand side where you can see a red-blue chair, that's the children's room. So one of the problems for me is the purism of these interiors doesn't seem to allow much room for humanity, and there certainly isn't any detritus. You could, in fact, make the spaces more intimate. These are sliding walls here. So where that red planking is here, this is actually, it's lino, but where that red section is, it demarcates the children's bedroom. So this is it from the outside. I mean, you can imagine when they were building it, that they thought an egg box was going up on the end of an otherwise very conventional row of Dutch houses. It dates to 1924, so it's 1 year after the House am Hoorn. And the service elements, there was servants' quarters actually, and a kitchen on the lower level, and the main living area is one great big space on what we would have called the piano nobile, the first floor. And it is completely open. And the thing that I find most remarkable are the windows, which, as you can see, completely open out in a very alarming manner. So there is no corner. And this technique, this weird window that makes the corner dissolve, becomes very much a sort of modernist leitmotif. So the only sort of real decoration in the Rietveldt-Schroeder house is colour. And colour is used to demarcate all the different elements. So you can see here that the area where the pots and pans in black, we've got on the drawers where the handles are picked out in blue. In the Bauhaus, the same idea. You can see here, this is at Dessau. So all the elements of the building are picked out in different colours. Again, a sort of constructivist technique, as though you've taken a flat pattern and turned it into something three-dimensional. So colour theory is really the Bauhaus way forward. So this is a fantastic poster that you can buy, emphasising the colours of the Bauhaus. My top image is showing you how the roof and the supports and the wall, they're all different colours. The risers, the staircase black, the rail red, and here we have them in a sort of colour laboratory, playing around with different colours. And I know it's a really bad photograph, I do apologise, but I think it gives you an idea of almost the scientific investigation of colour that the Bauhaus demanded. So they are forced out of the Weimar because their politics is seen to be too radical. Also, many of them are Jewish, and the whole thing becomes very, again, an unpleasant environment. So Walter Gropius actually solicits a new home. He sort of like casts out and to ask other cities in Germany if they would like the Bauhaus to move there. And in the end, it is Dessau that comes through, which is a major industrial city. They're already making bikes and airplanes. It's the home of Junkers. And you can see immediately they thought that bringing the Bauhaus to Dessau would improve their productivity and competitiveness. This is the main Bauhaus building with its amazing glass curtain running all the way down. You can see it even better now as it turns a corner. And this section here, like a bridge, goes over to a much more conventional building. And Walter Gropius had his offices in this bridging area. The glass wall is dramatic. It just literally hangs like a curtain. It's not attached to the floors. The air could circulate. The radiators are original. There was a series of pulleys, which again allowed for maximum ventilation. And we can see what it looked like here when it was actually, a working building. This is the weaving workshop, and weaving will be one of the many crafts. I mean, again, this is ironically, weaving is undoubtedly a craft. It becomes an art form at the Bauhaus as the women involved in particular wanted to sort of transform what was seen as a domestic craft into an art form in its own right. More of that in a minute. Well, in fact, more of it now. Here's Gunter Stolzer. This is the sort of thing that I mean. And she was the one of the rare female masters, of course, in charge of a womanly area, weaving. She was at the Bauhaus till 1931, when, again, inevitably she flees, in this case, to Switzerland. And these were designed as hangings rather than carpets, but she was also involved, as you can see here, with designing what looks to be a Mondrian de Stijl pattern for a chair. So it was an inclusive lifestyle. One embraced an entire culture at the Bauhaus. This is the auditorium. Marcel Brauer provided all of the seating, which, as you could see, tips up. And I have no idea what's going on in Oskar Schlemmer's triadic ballet. Here it is. I don't know what on earth he's supposed to be doing, the lampshade. But I wanted to put over the idea that you were, you're embracing an avant-garde ethos across the board in music, fine art, design, architecture. It is literally a brave new world. So in terms of furniture, Marcel Brauer stands out with his first all tubular metal chair, named in honor of Wasilli Kandinsky. He went to a bike factory to see if they could make it for him, but they just, I think, rather laughed. They didn't have the technology to do this yet. But then he went, it was the Adler bike factory that he went to, but then he goes to Junkers, which is the aircraft company, and they are prepared to take it on. Sort of emphasize machine woman, we've got a Bauhaus lady here modeling, as you can see, a Kandinsky chair wearing a face mask and metal. It always reminds me of Metropolis, you know, that again whole idea of the brave new world. But the important thing is remember that the interiors that the Bauhaus were advocating were open plan, and so transparency was fundamental, and the idea was that by getting rid of heavy upholstery, these chairs would become sculptural forms, that they will be translucent within the interior. I can show you what I mean with the chairs designed by Marcel Brauer. They all have numbers, as you can see. Again, this is all part of the sort of dehumanizing element. The cantilevered principle is actually invented by one Mart Stam, but Brauer definitely perfects it. But the idea is that when you sit on it, it disappears. So in these open plan interiors, this was the sort of main reason for stripping away a chair almost to its skeleton. Again, Heath Robinson doesn't like them. So here he's joined all the Marcel Brauer tubular steel chairs together into metal spaghetti. The cantilevered element is very important. I mean, it's not exclusively Bauhaus. I'm showing you at the top a diving platform. And in fact, the student quarters at the rear of the Bauhaus here appears to have many diving platforms. Every student has a little balcony on which he can go to get fresh air. Balconies are very important because, of course, as we saw from the very beginning with that guy diving, the sort of healthy mind in a healthy body is typically Bauhaus. So here is a range of iconic Bauhaus chairs. So the Marcel Brauer one at the top, and then the Mies van der Rohe ones down the bottom. They are to emphasize the cantilevering. I like the Marcel Brauer ones because I like that curvy linear element that you don't get with the Brauers. There are equally iconic chairs produced by the Bauhaus rivals, if I can put them that way. The tub chair, it's like a club chair, designed by Corbusier, which is still in production. His famous lounger, which is being modelled for you there by Charlotte Perriand, who we now know had a hand in designing much of this furniture. And the fauteuil down the bottom, which was inspired by a barber's strop, which accounts for those rather unusual leather arms. Wilhelm Varganfeld, he was designing for industry. So his glasswerk for the Jena factory, where the teapots and in fact everything in the service is made out of glass. But his most famous design is for the Varganfeld table lamp. If you see the glass version down the bottom, you can actually see the electrical current literally running up the glass tube. So this is, this is typical form must follow function, which was a standard, idea of the Bauhaus. Joseph Albers and Annie Albers are the famous duo, married couple of two souls united. Once the Bauhaus is over, Joseph Albers is best known for his sequence of paintings, which are homages to the square, painted between 1950 and 1976, and they too will end up in America. The tables at the top are as early as 1926-27, again showing you the importance of colour. So that's Joseph. There was relatively recently, there was a big exhibition on the Albers work at Tate Modern. And again, Annie is best known for her weaving, and they leave for America in 1933 with the closure of the Bauhaus. The most sad story associated in terms of the fate of the masters is Otti Berger, who attempts to leave, stays briefly in London, fails to get work, fails to get a visa to join her fiance. She wants a teaching visa to go to America. Despondently, she gives up and foolishly returns to Germany, to look after her ailing mother. And yes, you've guessed it, they all end up in Auschwitz, and Otti Berger is murdered in 1944. Lily Reich was more fortunate, and again, she's been concealed behind Mies van der Rohe. We now know that they collaborated on various projects, and that she was actually in 1929 artistic director of the German contribution to the Barcelona World Fair. So we've been doing a lot over the last few years to reinstate the women. I'm going to end by just sort of showing you how they attempted to create their brave new world through sort of ideal projects. So these are the masters' houses, which were semi-detached. Gropius had his own, but Maholi and Feniger, and then Muncher and Schlemmer, Kandinsky and Clay shared. The plan of them is down the bottom. One of them, this is the Walter Gropius house, which was the independent one, was completely destroyed in the Second World War. And this is a sort of like virtual reconstruction of it. It's not a, it's sort of like more an essence of how the house might have looked. Because we know, in fact, it would have had balconies, and, you know, and more sort of like synergy between indoors and outdoors. So here is Walter Gropius with Isa, his wife. In fact, I'm trying to remember how many wives he had, but he was married to, of course, Alma Mahler at one point. So he has a colourful life. But here he is in his sitting room with his wife in his Wasilli Kandinsky chair. And it's at this point, I think, that Melvyn Bragg would be very happy to live in this environment. Please note the sort of cactuses in the background. Everything was about, a machine for living, and thinking about the role of women and fewer servants. So this is the built-in furniture of the dining room, but most importantly, there was this hatch that led through to the kitchen, which of course was an exemplar of modern design. It was all, fitted. And there was even a sort of washing up revolution. It's not quite yet a dishwasher, but you could add a hose to hose down the plates. And a few years later, this is 1938, Wilhelm Varganfeld came up with his design Cubus, which is sort of looking ahead, isn't it, to the plastic tubs that we use in our kitchens today. But again, please note the importance of transparency. So this is the Kandinsky clay house. So you can see what I mean about that importance of balconies. It's not for sunbathing per se, simply the fact that they are fresh air freaks. And, you need to be able to create a synergy between exterior and interior. Again, we're not very keen on these flat-roofed Mediterranean-style houses in England for obvious reasons, all that rain. But these are two sun houses in Amersham. I rather like the idea that there might be more sun in Amersham. And I'm also showing you 2 Willow Road by the wonderfully named Erno Goldfinger. So this is what it looks like on the inside. So if you've ever been to visit it, it's National Trust, you'll know that you can open up everything on the main floor and have one giant space. And again, the windows completely open out to create this indoor-outdoor style of living. One of Erno Goldfinger's neighbours was Ian Fleming, and he hated the house so much that he chose that name for one of his arch nemesis, Goldfinger. So here is again Heath Robinson making fun of the flat-roofed modernist house, but they're not sunbathing or taking the air, they're hiking around it. So when we go inside the Bauhaus houses, you can see it's all about colour. That each element is individuated by colour, from the risers to each individual step and the rail. Everything is about picking out the individual elements in colour. There's no clutter. Everything is behind doors in built-in cupboards. So please note how beautifully arranged the shoes are. And you have a dressing table that's sunk in between the wardrobes. This was revolutionary in the 1920s. It's old hat now. But I do find the studio of Maholi Nudge rather amusing, because most of the artists' studios that I've been to visit are filthy, full of stuff. Whereas you can see here, Maholi's is as pristine as his way of thinking. And the idea was that well, not us, but the working classes would embrace this style of uniform living. So we were going to improve everybody with workers' houses. So this is the Taunton Estate. And the over 300 buildings were thrown up, or 300 houses were thrown up between 1926 and 28. They are standardized, but they are boring. They are small, but they were clearly cheap. But the interesting thing now is, as you can see, because it's still there, the desire that we have to make our houses individual. You know, we put a different garden in, or I love all the dustbins, of course, but we don't like this idea of uniformity, and we rebel against it. There was another of these idealized projects in Stuttgart. This is the Weissenhof Estate. Again, it's surviving. So here again, you can see on the set of 5 houses built by J.J.P. Oud that they've put marigolds outside this one to make it a bit different. And this element here was to chain your bike to. So it's all terribly practical. The lower section is Peter Behrens. He's still with us. And this exemplary, you know, project, many of the elements are still there. So this is designed by Walter Gropius, but working with Marcel Brauer, and was prefabricated. Again, this was to overcome all of the housing difficulties in the post-war era. Colour would have been the only element. So I'm showing you Marcel Brauer's nest of tables down the bottom to bring some colour in. This is Corbusier working with his brother Pierre Généré, with his, you know, characteristic pilotis, these pillars which he prefers. But again, if you want to be pernickety about this, it's a huge waste of space, isn't it, if you're looking for a new way forward. And this is Mies van der Rohe, who was in charge of the entire project in Stuttgart, where again, one gets the impression that the important thing is the rooftop garden. However, his most elegant building, this is Mies van der Rohe's Barcelona Pavilion of 1929. The original was demolished. But back in the, I think, 1980s, or it might have been early 1990s, this replica was built in Barcelona at the foot of Montjuïc. It was really just to open the exhibition. So it had no practical purpose over and above that. So it's really a beautiful space using luxurious materials, and again, emphasizing the importance of transparency, all these wonderful windows all the way around. And the Barcelona Chair, of course, comes out of it. This is the project that Lily Reich was in charge of. So here's the Barcelona Chair. And just to show you what I mean about these exemplary glass-walled buildings, where you might feel a bit like a fish in a goldfish bowl, we have the Kornhaus on the River Elbe, which is back in Dessau. And this was built for a brewery, and it has this wonderful, as you can see, seating area, a great big drum of glass on the ends. Or here, this is the Villa Turgengat, which is in the Czech Republic, by Mies van der Rohe, where some privacy is at least achieved by having frosted glass. If you watch things like, you know, designer homes, you can now actually have a technique where you can flip a switch and your windows will frost. I think it might cost quite a lot of money. It looks like a spaceship, and one of my, you probably gather that I have reservations about modernism. There's no sense of environmentalism here. I mean, I know we've been talking about fresh air and glass and transparency, but you're not using natural materials, and you're not integrating the architecture into the landscape in the way, say, that Falling Water and Frank Lloyd Wright is probably the best example. It does look like a spaceship that's come down. And inside, again, the open plan's lovely, but, you know, where do you put your knitting? And God forbid you should have any children that would upset the equilibrium of this beautiful, but probably too purist interior. Look at the expensive materials that have been used. Anyway, the Bauhaus, what happens to them all when it closes in 1933 is a story in its own right. I can only just point you, as it were, in the right direction. Wells Coates, who's one of our leading modernist designers, had already had a sort of flavour of Bauhaus by visiting Germany. But he gets together with, this is Wells Coates, with Jack Pritchard, and don't be put off by the name Serge Chemayoff, he's technically a British designer, and they decide to build these famous Lawn Road flats, also known as the Isokon flats, which was the name of Jack Pritchard's company. And because this was so advanced, many of the Bauhaus lived there briefly before moving on to America. And it's so famous, there's books written about it, spies have lived there, I think Agatha Christie lived there a while, but Walter Gropius, Marcel Brauer and Maholi all lived there briefly before moving to America. So if you want to get the book, here it is. Not an advert for me, but you can see, yes, so Agatha Christie, and she's one of the many interesting people that briefly lived in the Lawn Road flats. So my last couple of slides is taking us to America and Mies van der Rohe at his best and most controversial. The Farnsworth House, well, he and his client, Mrs. Farnsworth, who actually came to blows over it. Again, it's a giant glass spaceship that's landed in the middle of nowhere, and all of the air underneath, of course, they would argue is all this idea of, you know, art or building in a, you know, natural environment. It's like floats, doesn't it, over the grass. But it's, again, hard to imagine living in it. That's the kitchen. It's one giant space, really, with some partitions. That's the bedroom. Again, you might feel that you're a bit exposed. And this is the drawing room or living room. But again, it's incredibly pure, isn't it, in terms of its stripped down to the absolute essentials, and there is certainly no clutter. So I'm going to leave you just with this idea of what happens to modernism, because the sort of completely sort of straight line ethos of the Bauhaus was challenged by the Scandinavian architects, particularly Alvar Aalto and his biomorphic style. He also preferred wood to metal. So this is his famous modernist chair, as is his design for the Vipuri Library. You can see his famous footstool in the foreground, and the rippling character of the ceiling shows you that he's into curves and organic forms. So modernism is challenged, particularly in the 1950s, by a return to organic forms and natural materials, exemplified by Scandi Modern, which emerges post 1950. So for those of you who just want to come back to Art Deco at the end, so here from Osbert Lancaster's Home Sweet Homes, I love this book, we have the Functionalist Interior. There is, you know, your intellectual Melvin Bragg type with his Alvar Aalto table and chairs, and his Marcel Brauer chair, and his cactuses and his Radio 4. And then down the bottom, overstuffed in more senses of the word than one, we have Art Deco lady with all her bits and bobs, her gramophone for her music, and her Siamese cats and her Pekingese dog, because Art Deco loved the exotic. So it's a perfect, you know, his and hers, literally, with emphasizing that Art Deco was feminine and modernism was very much for male intellectuals. So I'll leave you to decide what camp you are in. Are you a De Stijl Gerald Rietveld type, exemplified by the famous Rietveld Schroeder house, or are you Art Deco? Here you are. This is the entrance to the Express building on Fleet Street. It's one of our most outrageously beautiful Art Deco interiors. And I have to say, as you probably gathered, I lean towards the Art Deco. Oh dear, I'm revealing my gender. Anyway, that's my last slide, because at the end of the day, what's really come down to us via the Bauhaus into the postmodernist interior are all those iconic objects. Thank you very much.